Welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next. Rabbi Ken Spiro, welcome back.
Always good to be back, Ellie.
So, wow, I cannot believe some of the stuff that I'm seeing right now in the news. Being here in Canada, living in a practically socialist country, it probably is, to us, this is small fries. But I think in the United States, when I was listening actually to the commentary podcast the other day, they opened up one of them by saying we're all sitting Shiva here in New York City because what is happening with the elections in New York is shocking, frightening, very intense. The sort of full onslaught of people who describe themselves as democratic socialists or just as straight out socialist communist getting into office in New York City, one of the largest Jewish communities in the entire world, is rocking the boat for so many people. And we're coming up to the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, which is a what is it? We're going to talk about that a little bit. It's a democracy, but it's not quite always the way I think that we talk about it. So we wanted to maybe delve into today a little bit about communism, socialism, Judaism, all the isms, and what is it that's happening in America today that can help us frame and understand and maybe hold with context as we've been doing this idea of remember what's next is if we can look back and see how things went before, maybe we can understand our present moment and how we go forward with it today. So, where do we start with this? How do we begin?
Wow, yeah. So we're literally this weekend we're coming up to the 250th. I remember the 200. That's how old I am. The bicentennial. There's some other term, sesqua, whatever. I can never
Yeah,
remember it in Latin.
sesquibicentennial. Yeah.
Whatever it is, which is pretty unbelievable. I mean, America is relatively speaking a new country, but very unique in its inception,
Hmm.
as it was founded as a democratic republic. We should definitely, unpack those terms a little bit because
Yeah.
they're slightly different, but also we've talked about previously, in terms of a very unique country for the Jewish experience, having not been founded with any state religion and having been founded as basically a democratic republic with all of the flaws that it had with slavery and everything else. It has been a very unique place for Jews to live in over the last several hundred years, especially the last 100 when Jewish population in America really exploded. And there's definitely a connection there. I mean, there's no question in my mind, Judaism, we'll talk about this too. There's so many different things to unpack in this discussion. Judaism, the biblical government of Israel, doesn't advocate for democracy. But I've quoted many times the famous quote from Winston Churchill. He said, democracy is the worst form of government except for every other system we've tried from time to time throughout history.
Right.
Perfect it isn't, but a democratic system with a capitalist economy with a certain level of social conscience and awareness, which is what the democracy fits in there because the people have a say in the government, has proven to be, in terms of modern forms of government, far and away the most successful form of government in terms of lifting the most people out of poverty, opening up the most opportunity. You could go on and on. Not that America's perfect, but it's certainly a heck of a lot better than pretty much everywhere else. We saw this in the World Cup, by the way. All of these, like Europeans, and Europe generally doesn't have such great respect for America because they view America as this uncultured place that's new and, McDonald's and then you see all these like football fans going nuts over what America has to offer in terms of the sheer abundance and opportunity and size and it's quite amazing to see the world's reaction to the United States. But at the same time, we also see, as you mentioned, America is really coming to the 250th anniversary. It's internally under attack. And as a historian, I'll tell you that countries generally should worry more about what's going on inside of them than outside of them, unless there's some major, if the Mongols are at your doorstep in the 13th century, internal politics doesn't count too much. But
Right.
generally speaking, in a stable world, it's the internal rot that proves to be more dangerous. And you see that a very significant percentage of Americans do not even want to fly the American flag. They think it's a symbol of something that's intrinsically evil and bad. That's a scary thing. It's not that everyone's like this. America still has a core of very proud, patriotic people. But if you don't value where you come from, your future looks pretty dim. And the fact that we have the political split in the United States is so extreme now. And we talked about the horseshoe idea of the extreme right and the extreme left kind of meeting in the back and how the Jews are being sandwiched in the middle. And America's under attack from both sides, but really the left in America has really moved left. There's definitely splintering on the right, but I think like it's way behind. Not that it can't catch up, but it's behind. And with the rise, as you mentioned in New York, of democratic socialism and Zoran Mandani and the fact that all of the candidates that he endorsed, you could see in all the primaries, congressional primaries, et cetera, there's this huge rise of this government that has the word democracy in it, but it's really focusing on socialism. And I think it's really good time to take stock as we're approaching 250th anniversary as Jews in the United States and as citizens of America and as just citizens of the world to really focus on understanding what these systems are politically and economically. And most importantly, Ellie, it's like to understand what works. Philip Dick, who's a science fiction writer who wrote that book, he wrote that became a TV series called The Man in the High Castle, which he himself is a science fiction author. So I find this very funny coming from a science fiction author. But he
Yeah,
has,
yeah. He also wrote the book that became Blade Runner.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Do androids
But
dream of electric sheep?
they say, by the way, if you want to know what the future is going to be, look at science fiction now.
Hmm.
But he had one of my absolute favorite quotes, probably my top 10 favorite quotes of all time. He says, reality is what continues to exist, whether you believe it or not. And the constant,
Mm.
as America's at this political crossing, and the Democratic Party is really being hijacked. The old candidates, people like Schumer and Pelosi, these guys are, first of all, they're really old. They're on their way out anyway, but they're going to be primaried out soon. You see that people like AOC and Zoran Mandani and all this, and the squad, and the fact that it's not just an economic idea, it comes with a kind of whole worldview internationally, a whole moral view, the association of the LGBTQ community and the Free Palestine, and even the flag that these people are marching around, which is like a hybrid between the LGBTQ flag and the Palestinian flag. It's weird on so many levels. We have to really understand what people are buying into and the implications of it, which are more than just economic. So
I think one of the things that struck me about this, because look, we can't deny that there's also tremendous movement towards the extreme right in what was the MAGA party. The difference is, I think, that they're getting kicked out of the party, right? Trump very much made a difference between those, the Megyn Kelly, the Tucker Carlson, the Candace Owens, the people who are, cuckoo bananas and saying wild things. He very clearly said they are no longer considered in the tent. Whereas in the Democratic Party, not only are they allowing the squad and those types of people, the Mamdanis a platform, they're moving the tent to fit with those ideas and policies. And I think that's one of the scariest or most challenging pieces if we don't want to be reactionary. Um, it's just concerning because you don't deal with extremism by moving the center. That's never going to be a winning solution. And I think that's partly where we're seeing is who's holding the center anymore.
yeah.
Even though on Wikipedia, interestingly enough, if you look up Republican government, it says the Republican government is right to far right, and the Democratic government is center to center left, which is amazing. Like
Mhm.
just the fact that that's how it's described on Wikipedia tells you a lot about Wikipedia. But I think in terms of needing a center, which is the place where people can go when they're not extremists,
Right, right.
is just not happening on the left anymore.
No, that's actually very true. And I've been saying for a long time, America really needs four parties. Used to have things like the Whig Party. Used to have parties in America a long time ago, but they really need a center left, center right party and a more, I'm not into extreme, but more right wing, a real conservative versus liberal, and then like whatever, Republican, Democrat, I don't know, something. But there has to be a little more nuance because it's dragging The Democratic Socialists are dragging that party to the left. And I think, Ellie, what's really good is we should just start, defining our terms.
Yeah.
America is not, democracy is a form of government that was created by the ancient Greece. It's the word demos kratos, which means the people govern. And this is Athenian 2,500 years ago, which is really, if you have to summarize democracy, it's really power to the people, that the people get to decide. And democracy can be subdivided into two groups. There's like what you call a pure democracy, where you vote on everything. Like all citizens have a vote and they vote on everything. Or
Hmm.
you have what's called, representational democracy, which is how the parliamentary systems of Europe and the United States run, that you vote for a senator, congressman, member of MP, and they supposedly represent you. So it's indirect, going according to majority rule system. A republic is a system of government. The difference is, in a republic, you have like a king or a president at the top. It's not just pure democracy, is kind of an egalitarian system. America is a democratic republic in that it has a structured system of government. It's an indirect democracy in that citizens vote, but there's no president. They did offer George Washington to be one, but he said, we got rid of one King George, you don't need another one. So they put a
Hmm.
president instead. And you have legislative bodies, you have the Senate and the Congress, and you have a judiciary, which is the Supreme Court, so the separation of powers. That is a huge point. But the really big difference in terms of a republic and a pure democracy is you have a constitution. Because in a pure democracy, citizens, if the majority decides tomorrow that down is up and then up is down, you vote that in, and that's what it is. When you have something like the Constitution, which is the great stability of the United States, they're not absolute in terms of the biblical government of God given, but that the really law, the Supreme Court's job is to interpret legislation in light of the Constitution as the most foundational body of principles that define what the United States is. The different amendments, the right to free speech, and the right to bear arms and whatever they are. These are rights that guarantee, and these are above it. The majority just can't vote them out.
Right.
You
So it seems like it creates a course correcting center even when things start to go awry. It's like, oh, we have to come back to, is this legal? Does this fit with our constitution? Does this fit with our law? So it's somewhat of a centralizing document that allows people to constantly bounce their extremist views off this central piece that says, can you do this or can you not do it?
right, and you
Um,
can exactly.
yeah.
You can amend the Constitution as a procedure whereby that is done through the government, but it's very difficult to do, and not, haven't been, over the course of American history, it is not done that frequently. So it gives a certain stability. So it is a really, in terms of a significant country, the world's first modern democratic republic. The ancient Greeks had the idea, and like Athens, but again, by the way, that was an oligarchy. That was landed men with land voted. So it was everyone else was disenfranchised, and even in the United States, in its inception, there wasn't, universal suffrage for women. It doesn't come till the 20th century. Men had to vote first, and not all men. It wasn't until I think 1869 in the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that after the Civil War that like everyone was guaranteed the right to vote, which included blacks in the United States who, going back earlier, were slaves in America. So it's been a process, but it's a democratic republic with indirect democracy where the people do have the ultimate say in that they vote for the institutions of government, the president and the Congress and the Senate, not the Supreme Court. But it's also, that's the political system. And politics and economics tend to go together. That capitalist systems, by definition, generally end up, I mean, that democratic systems generally end up being capitalist, so to speak. So it's also, you have to define those terms. Like people throw these terms around all the time: communist, capitalist, socialist. The essence of what a capitalist system is about is it's private individual ownership, the production of goods and services. There's different levels of government control within that, but it's basically private ownership. Some governments move in and control wages and prices more than others. In a truly free market economy, there would be no, it would be supply and demand. And okay, there's no system that really, I mean, more ancient systems worked on purely a barter system, but you don't have that. You basically have competition and private ownership, and it incentivizes people to be productive, and
Right.
it opens up opportunities for you. The other extreme would be a communist system, which is the elimination of private property, and that everything is centrally controlled by the government. The idea was from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. That is not what you do or what you produce, it's what you need you get. And whatever if you work hard and you produce more than you need, we take it away from you and give it to someone who doesn't have it. And then in the
Yeah,
middle,
I'm curious about
yeah.
the communist thing because it always seems to me such a strange paradigm because everybody says, oh, communism means everybody has the same. But really, what you're doing is you're surrendering what you have to certain people that are higher up in the government who now control everything that everybody has. And those people controlling it aren't, don't have the same as everybody else. It inevitably creates a very top heavy system where there are certain people who have everything or all kinds of stuff, and everyone else has to settle for whatever they can share. So it's always such a strange idea to me, this idea that like, oh, it means everybody gets anything, everything. So, um, and I think Jews have a long history with communism and socialism. So how did this come about?
Right. So first of all, communism as an economic idea was basically founded by Karl Marx, and who was his parents were Jewish, but they converted. His father converted to Christianity. I think Lutheranism. I don't remember exactly. This took the 19th century to further, as many Jews did in Germany, like Heinrich Heine, who wrote the famous essay, My Ticket to Western Civilization. They weren't into Christianity. They just did it to further their careers. In his case, I believe his father was a lawyer, and Friedrich Engels. And they wrote this pamphlet, Communist Manifesto, in 1848, and which advocated the creation of basically a workers' paradise, a stateless society. Remember, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And it was, by the way, it comes out of an idea that, unbridled capitalism can be a very oppressive system of government too. When everything is profit, 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 you have people who accumulate, just in feudal systems, the same thing. People accumulate massive amounts of land and leave everyone out of the system as either, basically peasants who are the feudal property of their lords, or sharecropping and eking out a meager living. So it's not that one system is perfect and but this, with
Right.
the Industrial Revolution, which is when you talk about in the 19th century, that's late 18th, early 19th century, all these things start appearing: technology and industrialization. The great move from agrarian society to industrialization creates explosion of population in cities and a huge working class, which is to a very largely extent exploited. That's the growth of things like unions, which initially were a really good idea. Workers should unite and use their power to advocate for decent working conditions. Everything, when taken to extremes, can be very bad, like unions
Right.
becoming very corrupt and demanding outrageous salaries that make them non-competitive with third world countries that aren't unionized, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. But there was a tremendous amount of exploitation of working class people. So this came up an idea. Now, it's not shocking that it comes from a Jewish brain. Now, Marx may have been raised as a Christian, even though he was an atheist, and he called religion the opiate of the masses, one of the tools used by the system to oppress the workers, and keep people down. And you could definitely argue in medieval Christianity, it was openly, the teachings of Paul were openly used to teach people to stay in their place and
Yep.
accept where they are in this world, and the next world will be better.
Yeah, it was
Um,
almost like imposing a caste system through Christianity. Like you're a peasant because God wants you to be a peasant, and I'm
right.
above you because God wants me above you. So yeah, definitely they would have looked at religion in that way and been like, yeah, this is a class system, not
It's
a
part
caring
of
for the people.
it's part of the system of inherent oppression of the masses kind of thing. But Marx, nonetheless, and we've done whole, people go back to listen to, maybe I'll post a previous episode on Driven, the Jewish personality. We talk about that there's personality traits, while not being exclusive to Jews. Jews have an overabundance the revolutionary, radically transformative thinking beginning with Abraham, always thinking outside the box, to connect to one invisible God, infinite invisible God, when the whole world is worshiping idols. But to push radically transformative ideas in the world requires drive. Jews are disproportionately driven people. Non-Jews can be driven too. And the third is that Jews care. I mean, Abraham had the tent with the four doors to have guests from all angles. Chesed, caring. I mean, again, non-Jews can care, but Jews are obsessed with caring, which is why, going back to your question, if you take any cause or political ideology to make the world a better place, communism, socialism, feminism, black civil rights, anti-apartheid, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, yada, 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 it's almost always founded by a Jew and or run by Jews, because changing the world, boom, which makes Jews, by the way, very politically distinctive people in politics in the world today. I mean, think about it. If we beam ourselves back, since we're focused on remember what's next, the Jewish idea, I mean, we're the ultimate top-down people. What's the ultimate Jewish top-down solution? It's really, what does Abraham want to do? Go back to the very earliest episodes, like
Right.
season one, episode 1 and 2. It's to bring connection to God and the values and the rules that come from the perfect creator of the universe down into the world. That's the way to
Mhm.
create as perfect a world as humanly possible and give humanity collectively the greatest level of pleasure. So that is kind of hot wired into our DNA, even on, I would say, a subconscious level. And when Jews leave Judaism behind, which has been the experience of so many Jews since emancipation, the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleonic Wars, and Jews finally getting rights and being able to mainstream into society and express themselves politically and even hold office, like people like Benjamin Disraeli and stuff like that. They naturally, since they're wired for top-down solutions, we want it and really feel this responsibility to take care of the world. They will, and I have whole talks just on this topic. It's so interesting.
Mm.
They will create or gravitate towards those versions of government that they think will kind of do God's job, meaning take
Right.
care of you. And you can see that in uh, a capitalist system is very much about your own initiative. It's minimum government intervention. It's giving people the most opportunities to exercise their free will. Communism is the other extreme, where basically everything, all the resources, the wealth, the communally distributed to the individual is needed. It sounds really good. Doesn't work, of course. Socialism is kind of in between. Margaret Thatcher had the best line about socialism. He says, a socialist, I think she said it, is just a communist with more patience. It, it's the community or the government, right, should own and manage the society's wealth and resources. It doesn't outlaw private ownership of property, but it's top priority should be making sure that everyone is taken care of. There is private ownership for sure, but the major
Which, by
industries,
the way,
essential
sounds
resources,
lovely,
yeah,
right? But so that sounds lovely. Everybody should be taken care of. And look, I think I live in Canada, so there we have socialized, healthcare, socialized education. There are many things that are socialism here. I think that always the challenge is, again, as you mentioned, are we going to extremes? And
right.
are we imposing what one person thinks is best for everybody on everybody, even those who feel it's not the best thing for them?
Exactly. But that's what happens as soon as you take the power away from the people, then that always opens up the door to totalitarian regimes. So we have these systems laid out. Jews are disproportionately attracted to them. By the way, this people say Sweden is a socialist country. No, it's not. The Nordic countries, which happen to be the countries that generally considered to be the best quality of living. They rate this like some of the happiest. I mean, Israel rates as number five, but like Sweden, places like that. Switzerland is very different than that, but they rate very highly. These are social democracies, which basically are free market countries, but with high taxation and very highly developed social welfare infrastructure to make sure that basic needs are taken care of in terms of medicine and, like you have social security kinds of systems like that. But it costs, you're paying a very high percentage. These are not socialist countries. They're social democracy. So that's like kind of somewhere in the middle, and it works it kind of works in those countries where you have a population. Of course, the problem with all these countries is their birth rates are so low. There's going to be no one working to pay for all the social welfare benefits.
Right.
Because with the exception of Israel, no country in the developed world has a birth rate that exceeds replacement level rates of 2.1 children per family, which is economic suicide. But the communist system has proven to be a total and complete failure, because it creates tremendous. I mean, the reality is, okay, if we go back to what we are talking about with Jews, these systems sound really good in theory. We just have everyone work their hardest and produce and share, and it sounds so nice. But again, human nature just doesn't really work that way. People need to be incentivized to do stuff. You need to be rewarded for your efforts. I lived for half a year in the Soviet Union when I was a graduate student, and I saw the complete failure of a system where there was no commercial goods. Restaurants had numbers, restaurant number 236. Nothing was available. There was no incentive to do anything. You could sit around and do nothing all day long and make the exact same amount of money and never lose your job as someone. Why work hard? So only, and not only that, as much as you don't want to have unbridled competition, only competition on some level and rewarding people for their efforts produces excellence. These are you can talk about there's the way it is and the way it ought to be, but this is human nature has to always be factored into these systems. So a communist system to work correctly has to have generally, because it's top down everything, government controls everything, to enforce collective ownership, etc. You have very strong centralized government. So forget the democracy, that's gone. So the people lose their power. They become incredibly inefficient systems. And what becomes, and you can see this, the glorification of the party and the mass as opposed to the individual is the complete negation of the individual, which is why in these communist systems you get such horrific suffering and death. And the communism has, we talk about Hitler in World War II and how many people he killed, and 6 million Jews and 12 million people, but he's down there on the list. Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, and the Cultural Revolution, 1960s, they estimate that between 45 and 65 million people, Chinese, were killed in China. In Russia, forced collectivization, like destroying the agriculture by forcibly collectivizing, it never works. And Stalin, was the lowest number I've seen is 20 million, which is as many Russians who's died fighting the Nazis, basically. Up to 60 million people may have died, that Stalin may have killed. You have in Cambodia with Pol Pot, 1.5 to 2 million people killed. These systems have proven to be horrendously bad. They do not work. So you can talk about it, but I think it's another great Margaret Thatcher line. She says, "Socialism works till you run out of other people's money."
Right.
So it's just these systems are very tricky. When you have a truly highly productive society that has enough capitalist free market economic system to produce the wealth necessary to fund the government programs, then they can keep going, but they tend to become very inefficient. The other side is not great either. Look at the health system in America, which there is, except, like, okay, you have Medicare and Medicaid, which are going bankrupt. To have no something in the middle. This is not a class on what form of medicine works best, but if you go to OHIP in Canada, I think it's called OHIP, right? Or you go to National Health in England, they literally are triaging people to die in some of these places because, you're old and we don't have the money anymore and the system is overtaxed and there's no competition.
Well,
Something in between Israel.
I think it's not so much like, look, here in Canada, one of the conversations is around MAID, right? How many doctors are just recommending patients, the doctors kill their patients because otherwise they'll be in palliative care for a long time. Now, but I think there are definitely incredibly good things about having socialized medicine, meaning if you need a doctor when you need a doctor, you can see a doctor,
Yeah.
right? That the same as socialized education. If you have a kid and you want them to go to school, they can go to school, no matter what. There are different levels of how good that care is, how good that education is, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some really good things about it if it's run properly. I think one of the things that we're seeing here, for instance, in Canada is it's running out of money fast. And then when you start to run out of, as Margaret Thatcher said, other people's money, what do you do? And who decides what cuts are made? Who decides how you're going to deal with that problem? And it's generally not the people, interestingly enough.
Yeah, 100%. And when you have systems like that, where again, your actual population is shrinking, so there's less people working and paying into the system, and you're taking in a lot of immigrants, a huge percentage are coming in to take advantage of that system. You see in Europe is being flooded by refugees from the Middle East and Africa, and their gold standard places to get are not Greece and Italy and Portugal and places that are basically broke. They want to get to Germany, England, France, and the Nordic countries, get to Sweden, get to Denmark, get to Norway. But this is a huge burden on your economy. Again, I don't really want to go into a deep dive into this, but we see that it's tricky. None of these systems are really perfect. But if we had to like take a vote on what seems to work the best, a democratic system that's not a pure democracy is, that an indirect democracy, a Republican kind of system seems to be most successful, a la what the United States is, with an economic system that is capitalism with a conscience, um, that is open to opportunities, and you're rewarded for your efforts, and you can create wealth and really move yourself from poverty to success, but not rampant. But you have to have a certain level of social responsibility. Government needs to be involved. The balance, there's no perfect system, but people are sitting there ripping into the United States, the 250th anniversary, and for all of its problems, America still is the place. And as much as many people in America don't want to, wave the flag on the 4th of July, and some of them are going to do it upside down and protest, you don't see, there's millions of people, especially in the previous administration, pouring over the border. Now that's not so easy to do, but you don't see this happening in a lot of countries in the world. Like, why is all of South America trying to come to, the United States? And a good percentage. I remember when the border was open, I remember some border guy talking about there's like 123 different nationalities coming into the United States. So for all of its faults and failures, it has proven to be really one of the most successful systems of government that the world has ever seen, and one which has offered Jews tremendous opportunity, but one which is really tremendously in peril. Again, going to the undermining of the 1619 project, all things we've seen in the last couple of decades taking off of America's founded on the original sin of slavery, and it's an evil exploitive place. It's full of racism and intolerance. These things that America was founded on slavery, I think, is an overstatement. That it existed as an institution and was done away with by, ironically, Republicans. It's interesting.
I think it's also wild because then that whole premise just assumes that every other country in the world is saintly and wasn't built on war and wasn't built on killing people and wasn't based on taking land and wasn't run by either Mongols or some kind of like people, Vikings who killed lots of people in order to secure their land and run the place. So it's such a strange, particularly we used to make jokes that everyone in the US knows more about the US than anything else in the world. They're very like self-centered in that way.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing that play out, like as if the US is the only place in the world that has a sullied past that is far from perfect, as if any person in the world doesn't have a sullied past and is far from perfect. Like I just think it's such a strange purity test and of like only if you're perfect and you did it perfectly are we going to be able to support you, and that means no one and nowhere. So it's interesting to me, this whole idea of the US is evil because it has a non-perfect past, so not Jewish in that way.
Yes, it's only perfect being is God. Um, we'll talk about his system of government, also what he likes, but it's extremely narrowly focused, short-sighted to think that this America is just rotten to the core with evil, needs to rebuild and deconstructed and reconstructed, and to do it with hardcore progressive left-wing political ideologies which have been proven not to work. I mean, if we could argue, people can argue this back and forth over and over again, but I'm telling you, it seems very clear to me that a free market economic system with certain level of control and government responsibility and a certain amount of it, not too much, creates the greatest opportunity and wealth to be shared by all. And the greatest thing you can do to your population is to open them up to as many opportunities as possible and remove whether it's governmental or political restrictions, which is what democratic countries don't have. You're a citizen of the country, and to remove economic restrictions. You work hard, you go forward. That creates the greatest amount of shared wealth, prosperity, and opportunity. People will still argue this point, but I believe it's inarguable. And from a historical perspective, you can live in La La Land and talk about what you'd love to see, but going back to what we were saying, Ellie, we see with Jews still tend to be the people who, because we're so hot-wired to care and to want to make a difference and to change, that we Jews tend to be more dedicated to this ideology than anyone. I mean, the head of the Democratic Socialist movement, the actual movement was founded by Michael Harrington in like 1984, I think it was. But Bernie Sanders is the grandfather of the movement today.
Right.
He has all, but it's not something new. We go back to all these different forms of government, and Edmund Wilson, who is an American literary critic from the early 20th century, he had a great line. He says, "The Jew lends himself easily to communism because it enables him to devote himself to a high cause involving all of humanity, characteristics which are natural to him as a Jew." He says Jews are naturally going to be attracted to progressive left-wing top-down ideologies because he says it's a high cause. We're the ultimate high cause. Bring God and godliness into the world, involving all of humanity. The Jewish idea is that we are supposed to be the light to nations, to lead humanity back to as perfect a world as humanly possible. And he says what's interesting. These are characteristics which are natural to him as a Jew, which means you don't have to go to Hebrew school to know them or have a rabbi tell you them. Bernie Sanders may be a totally ignorant Jew and a socialist, but he's just as Jewish as any other Jew, and that Jewish soul is pushing him to the top. And it explains why you watch the Democratic Party metastasizing to the hard left, which is rife with anti-Israel, anti-Semitism. Look what happened to Scott Wiener in San Francisco. Here's this Jewish extreme left-wing pro-LGBTQ politician who came out and and came out as Israel's doing genocide because he wanted to, stay in. That's part of the whole sort of ideology that's coming, unfortunately, with that point of view. And he was just, you have to see these videos of him all over like of him being like screamed at for being a genocidal maniac because he's basically Jewish. The revolution is
Just to
consuming
clarify,
itself.
meaning there's clips right now of him showing up to some of the pride parades
Yeah.
as a government official who um, at one point actually refused to answer that question about genocide in Israel and then clarified later on in a video where he said, actually, I do think that's what's happening. But now he walks into spaces where there's a bunch of pride parades and he's being ostracized, screamed at, yelled at, and kicked out of those spaces for being Jewish, basically, and saying that he supports genocide and all of those things. So, meaning no matter how far backwards he bends himself, once they understand that he's a Jew, he will eventually be excised from that community.
Exactly. But you see, it's a very big wake-up call for Jews in America because until today, like 70, 80% of Jews in America vote like on the national level. When it comes to Congress, Senate, President, they're very dug into the Democratic Party. They came in that way back in the day. We have to remember the Democratic Party was back in the day when Jews started to pour into the United States. That was more the workers' party, the party of the unions. It's all switched, by the way. It was also the party of the Deep South and the segregationists. People don't realize that Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president who ran on a platform of preservation of the Union, keeping the United States together, and abolition of slavery. And people don't really remember that. The 13th Amendment of the United States in 1864, which was the abolition of slavery, only a few Democrats voted for it, and like 100% pretty much of the Republicans voted to abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment, which is giving citizenship, was again, like again, almost 100% of Republicans voted for it. This was to give black people citizenship, and zero Democrats vote for it. The 15th Amendment, I think it was in 1869, giving like people the right to, it was basically giving black people the right to vote, was again complete, almost across the board Republican support, and Democrats were against it. That all switched. It starts to switch with Roosevelt in the 30s and the New Deal and the progressive nature of, and it goes through in Truman. And then when you get into the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act, then you really have the complete switch of the Democratic Party to become, interestingly enough, the party where African Americans, blacks supported overwhelmingly. But there's been a huge change in the politics of the United States. So people really don't appreciate what has happened since then. And the Democratic Party since the 1960s has changed dramatically from what it used to be. It was definitely into the civil rights movement and definitely into a lot of progressive political ideas. So when Jews came into the United States as the underdogs, as a small minority, working in sweatshops, the party of the unions, the party of the underdog really attracted them. But there was a deeper connection, which we've already talked about this, these are the people who are the top down. Republicans generally are more of the free market. You take a Tea Party guy, which I don't even hear that term used anymore. But unlike the Democrats who want large government, a lot of taxes, a lot of legislation, cradle to grave will take care of you, the right side wants small government, little taxes, minimum legislation, as much personal independence, and a lot of them want a gun to make sure they can protect those rights. So that has not been, it's kind of like not innately attractive to the Jewish personality. And by the way, we talked about this before. Judaism is a combination of both. Judaism is top down, meaning bring God and the values of God into the world, but it's bottom up. It's all about personal autonomy and responsibility. It's not like sit back. I mean, that's the criticism that
Right.
Samuel gives to the Jewish people when they ask for a king. Place a king over us. And he says, no, you need to place a king over yourself, Samuel says. You need to maintain your autonomy and your freedom and take responsibility for yourself. You just don't want people like at a certain level, people like just to have that burden taken away from them. Just tell me what to do. It's to
Yeah, I
take
definitely
responsibility for
feel
my
like Judaism often errs on the side of like ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Like that's the covenantal experience at Sinai where God says, here's all the things that are my part of what I'm going to do for you as your king, your governor, your father, your creator, and here's all the things that you have to do in order to make all of this work. And it's a very clear relationship of responsibility and good relationships are filled with responsibility.
Exactly. And the Jewish governmental system, by the way, since we're talking about Jews and Jewish spiritual DNA and what they're driven towards, and democracy being, a free market capitalist democratic system with a social conscience seems to be the most effective form of human government. Judaism would say no. It's the best, like Churchill said, it's the best system, worst system except for every other system. It gives the most freedom and most tolerance and most stability and most opportunity. But Judaism, the governmental system, is not democratic. It is insofar as the judiciary, the Sanhedrin, goes according to the majority rule, but you have a monarchy. There's a king. He's not elected, he's appointed. Okay, but there's checks and balances on his power, the separation of powers. He's not an absolute monarch. You have a high court system. You have a whole judiciary which has a Supreme Court of its own called the Sanhedrin, which goes according to the majority, which is based not on the Constitution of the United States or legal precedents, but on principles given by the creator of the universe to humanity, which are, by the way, the foundational principles largely of Western democracy, the Ten Commandments. You have religious tolerance, freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, which is not that there's no religion, that is completely a misinterpretation, but rather you worship God in the way you see fit, whether it's organized religion or being a deist, like some of the founding fathers were definitely deists, like Franklin at the end of his life, and I think Jefferson was also. But God is essential, and morality coming from God. John Adams says it openly. But that system is the Judaism would say is the best system. Democracy has intrinsic weaknesses. As we say in Yiddish, the oilam is a goyim. The masses are basically, they say the masses are asses. But the people, what the majority decides they want is not necessarily what's the best thing for a country. The majority can be very ignorant and be very self-centered. We all want stuff, so we'll vote for guys who will give us stuff. It doesn't necessarily work, but it creates a certain level of stability and protects individual rights and protects a certain level of freedom. But Judaism would say that's
Eh,
not the ideal system.
And
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 yet,
I think it's
yeah.
also more balanced than that. If you think like in the US, there's the idea that, not everybody always knows what they want and they're not always deeply educated in every issue so that they're the people who should really be making policy, but everybody also is free to get whatever information they want, to say whatever they want, to stand up for whatever they want to be a part of the democratic process. So it really is kind of that balance. But I do think it's interesting that when I mentioned to you earlier, I started rewatching The West Wing, and how much God is talked about in that show by this Democratic government that's in the White House, legislating for the people, and that God is a big topic of conversation, and that the president in that show was going to be a priest and instead becomes the president. So I think it's a really fascinating thing. This idea that the Democratic Party doesn't believe in God or is anti-religion is really a new thing.
Well, that's exactly when you take that's kind of going to Will Hilberg, who's an American Jewish sociologist in the mid 20th century. Um, he had this idea of the cut flower ethics, which was that when so much of Western liberal democracy, as John Adams says in that famous letter to H.M. Vanderkamp, that the idea of God is the essential principle of all civilization is the most, and all morality and all civilization. He is. The idea of an absolute standard of right and wrongs is not subject, just as the Constitution can't be, that the people on the street can't say, that's it, we're dumping this government, we're going to vote for something totally different. The God-given standard of an infinite being who creates all and loves his creation that's the ideal standard. Will Hurlburt, when he wrote about this, and he said that that cut flowers in a vase look nice for a week, but they severed from their roots and they eventually wither and die. So too with the values that make up Western liberal democracy. They're overwhelmingly based on Judeo-Christian ethics. We've talked about this in the past, how much in the great political revolutions of that's begin early on, 17th, 18th centuries, the great early political thinkers, Locke and Hobbes and Eric Selden and Hugo Grotius and all these people we read about who are the founding fathers of a lot of what we call modern political development, how many of them were Hebraists and influenced by these ideas and incorporated them into the political worldview that creates the modern liberal democratic world we have today. When you cut that off from God, then they wither and die. And that's what we see. We see concepts like liberalism. John Locke, the father of the idea, would be horrified at what's being called liberal today. Libertarianism is more what I think his worldview. That's another discussion. But we see that this is dangerous because we've lost the center. And again, we're not advocating that the whole world should adopt the Jewish system of government. That's unique to a biblical government in the past and in the future, in the Messianic era. The Messiah is a king in the government of a king who is a God-fearing person who only wants the best for himself and can't have too much this and too much that. Judaism lays out what a king has to do. He has to wear a Sefer Torah attached to his arm to know there's a king of kings. He can't have too many horses and too many wives and too much this, and there has to be a Sanhedrin. He can't legislate. He's given occasionally extrajudicial powers in emergencies, but there's all kinds of checks and balances in that system, which make it in many ways, an ideal political system. If people buy in, you have to buy into the system and be behind it. And the economic system of the Bible is not a pure capitalism unbridled, but it's kind of like I think it was a Schumacher was his name. He had a book called Communism, Capitalism with a Conscience. It's a free market system, but it has a lot of checks and balances and infrastructure, social welfare infrastructure, the obligation to give charity, the obligation to give tithes, the obligation to preserve the environment. there's so many things in there. So it's really, this is what the early people who were looking back, you're talking about the great thinkers in Western civilization, when trying to move the world away from the feudalism and pure monarchies and these kind of dictatorial systems that were set up of hierarchy that you could not escape. They were saying, why would we want to invent something new? If God is perfect, then the system of government he gave the ancient Hebrews has to be the perfect system. And they actually went into not just the text of the Bible, but into all the commentators, people like the great medieval scholar Maimonides, who really dissects statements from the Bible. Don't give you the blueprint. You have to go into the oral law to understand. And they use this to create a lot of the thinking behind the growth of Western liberal democracy, the abolition of slavery and feudal systems, and the weakening and ending of monarchies, and the creation of what we have today in the Western world, which has proven to be the most successful system for the most number of people. But it all comes out of those roots, which are now being disconnected. And ironically, a lot of the people historically who have been disconnecting humanity from their roots are like well-intended but misguided Jews, people like Karl Marx and Bernie Sanders, who do not have the Jewish the Torah software package to direct their well-intended radical thoughts into a model that actually may actually work. It's kind of scary, but the fact that Jews are still so glued to it is quite interesting. Wanted to read you one. And Norm Potter, it's a neoconservative, he wrote in 2009, Why Are Jews Liberal? He says something very interesting. He says, in short, Jewish political behavior continues to contradict many commonplace assumptions. If we go by the most commonplace of all these assumptions, that people tend to vote their pocketbooks, we are forced to conclude that in continuing to vote for the Democrats, Jews have, in the last few decades, been voting against their own interests. Jewish liberals, in parentheses, he says, which is to say most Jews, take pride in as a mark of their refusal to put self-interest, which they equate with selfishness, above the demands of social justice. Now, we've talked about this before, but because even Jews who are really disconnected from Judaism are hot-wired to care, we see that the number one point of identity was in a Pew Research study done a number of years ago when they said the word Jew to Jews. Commitment to social justice came in at over 50% as the number one point of Jewish identity. So social justice is definitely a part of Judaism. It's part of our economic political system, but it is not Judaism. It has to be couched in that broader system. But because Jews are so idealistic, they just stay glued to it. And as Norm Potts just talking about, even as Jews rose through the socioeconomic ladder to become one of the highest, if not the highest income earning bracket in the United States, and the Democratic Party tends to be like tax the rich. Look at the Democratic Socialists. You can see that the party that therefore, as people move up, they tend to change their affiliation to the party that will most suit their pocketbook. And Jews have tended not to do that. They've tended to stay, because it's in our DNA, they've tended to stay loyal to what they view to be the party of the underdog. So even if I have to pay for it, Jews are the people who will actually do it. I heard someone say it very
Yeah.
funny. It's no one should take it personally, but they said Jews today earn like Episcopalians, but vote like Latinos.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge, or maybe for me, one of the ways that I'm trying to understand it is in many ways the new unholiness, right? The worst possible thing that you could be in America is racist. And in some ways, the Republicans have been saddled with the label, this is the racist party, and the Democrats are the non-racist party. These are the one, and once you're saddled with that, for Jews, when you think about being Republican, you're like, yeah, but I'm not racist. Even though that's not necessarily true, but it's become the label that's been applied in this very binary way, that Republicans hate minorities and are racist, and that Democrats love minorities and are not racist. And therefore, if you're a Democrat, you're good, and if you're a Republican, you're bad. And I think it's become this very strange binary choice. And for Jews who are sensitive to the plight of the stranger, right? Don't forget you were strangers in Egypt. We're always for social justice. It makes it very hard to say I'm a Republican because the word on the street is that Republicans hate minorities and they're racist and they're not good people.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very weird and brilliant psyop that was done to make people in the United States believe that that's the binary choice between those two parties.
Yeah. And it comes like everything else we've seen of a misunderstanding of terms. People don't understand what fascism is. They don't understand what Nazism is. They throw the terms around like crazy. Um, and racism, only white people can be racists. Only men can be, racists. It's not true. A black person who espouses negative thoughts towards a Jew it's a racist ideology. I'm not saying all black people are doing that. God forbid. That's not the point. But it can go many ways. And the reality is stirring up the pot, and it's part of this. America's still corrupt and horrible. I grew up in America in the 60s as a little kid. My elementary school was the first bus school in the United States. Busing was tried on the New Rochelle public school system. I didn't live in the South, but I remember the stuff. America is not a racist country. The problems that existed 50 years ago, 60 years ago in the United States do not exist anywhere. Not that it's not perfect, but the notion that only the right can have these ideology extremes on both sides, we're looking at the center being gutted and the extremism just metastasizing and is dangerous. And the sad irony of all of this is the Jews, the people who are so into caring about everything more than anyone statistically. You can demonstrate this. It's going to be a serious reckoning is coming for Jews with what's happening to the Democratic Party because the connection of the political, the Democratic socialist political economic ideology with a whole bigger, as we say in Hebrew, hashkafa worldview about racism and occupation and Zionism and this and that. It's going to be real tough. It's going to be real tough. And Jews are feeling torn between their loyalty to the ideology versus their self identity. And if history proves one thing, it's even siding with the people who dislike you doesn't save you, a la Scott Wiener and many other people. But what it really is a call for some clarity and a call for sanity on the part of Jews to really, I mean, people just are, there's so much superficiality. People really need to start doing a little bit of more of an objective deep dive
Yeah.
into political ideologies, into the history of them, into what works, into what doesn't work to understand there's the way I would love it to be, but then if you want to get something done in this world, you have to think practically. And nothing extreme ever works well. Moderation is the key. That's the Jewish take on everything. And it's the logical take on how a world governmentally and economically needs to be run. But we're living in very monumental times. Scary
Mhm.
stuff I mean, I'm living back in America for the first time in more than 40 years, and I am so worried about what I'm seeing. And because I haven't been here, it's kind of, I'm looking at it with a little slightly fresher eyes.
Right.
I am really, it's like a time capsule. I've been being back in the United States and
Yeah.
where I always visited back and forth to be actually here and much more immersed in it and see what's going on. To me, it's much more in my face, but it's like that old Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. So as America's approaching its 250th anniversary as the bulwark of freedom and democracy in the world, people need to see past who the president is today they don't like and stuff like that, but go to the deeper issues, of what
Yeah.
political system, what economic system, what values do we want in our country? What works? What's going to keep us together versus ripping us apart? Very, very,
Yeah, and I think the realization that all of these freedoms that we have that to protest, to say all kinds of crazy things, to elect crazy people, um, eventually we might have to fight for those rights
yeah.
because what's coming down the pipeline is we won't have the ability to do those things. These freedoms that we take for granted can so easily disappear, especially if people don't know that they're worth fighting for, right? The idea that America's evil, unfortunately, leads to why would I fight for it, right? And what's the alternative? Just letting it go, letting it burn? How does where does that, if you traced that idea to its eventual end, what happens there? So I think it's such an interesting thing that people don't take that thought to its inevitable conclusion and say, you won the birth lottery by being born into a country where you have rights and freedoms and all of the things that you have. And if you're not willing to fight for them, then, how's that going to go if everybody makes that choice too?
Right, which is probably why so many revolutionaries like Che Guevara and Zoran Mandani come from very privileged upper class families.
Yeah.
Che was Argentinian, he's a doctor. Look, he became a radical, and he was not a nice human being if you read about him. But he's the icon because he looked great in a beret with that cute little beard. But
Yeah, because
freedom is
they would never have to live the consequences of their
right.
policies because once you're rich, you're always rich.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think the idea that, all these, I mean, look at Bernie Sanders and, this whole, get rid of the billionaires tour. Meanwhile, he's a multimillionaire. The whole thing's ridiculous.
right,
You're basically enforcing policies on people that you yourself will never be beholden to.
right. And like I said, freedom is not free, and you got to have clarity. And like I said at the beginning, a nation that doesn't value its past has no right to dream about its future. And that's a great lesson for the Jewish
Mm.
people to understand, and it's certainly a great lesson for Western civilization to understand. And as we've said, being remember what's next, and it says a nation doesn't learn from its past, and this is their big point, is going to have a very tough time getting there. It's going to make a lot of mistakes. So let's hope we get some sanity and some moderation. This is what the world needs. It's what Israel needs internally. It's what America
Yeah.
needs. It's what Western society really, really needs some clarity. And we should, as we, this weekend, as we approach, I don't think it's an accident. It's going to be like a really boiling hot in
Yeah.
Washington, D.C. It's going to be like one of the hottest the July 4th ever. I think that's because the stuff's really hot. The world is heating up on many different levels, and we need it to cool down. We definitely need it
I'm
to cool
curious, can
down.
you actually say that quote again, that if we don't like know our past,
Yeah.
we can't dream about our
What
future?
he
How
said,
did you
he
say
said,
that
a
again?
nation that doesn't value its past has no right to dream about its future. Like if you're going to
Yeah.
destroy who you are, we come from evil. You're not going to, then you got to destroy it. You're not going to dream about a future. You're just going to want to tear it down.
I
And,
think that's
and
such an
yeah,
interesting quote, even to apply that to the Jewish people.
yeah, for
Right. I
sure.
think as the Jewish people, if you are a Jew who doesn't value your past, your connection to Judaism, where we came from, understand our history, then how can you possibly imagine or dream where we should be going in the future and that you could be part of that? I definitely think that's one of the questions that we don't talk about a lot in Jewish spaces, which is we're more often just talking about survival. Like, can we pay for our groceries? Can we survive the next year or so? Where are we going to be in 5 years? But the question rarely comes up. I remember asking this in a survey that I did, asking a bunch of Jews about their experience. Like, if you had to, where do you think Judaism is going to be in 50 years? What is it going to look like? Where is it going to be? How are we going to be living it? All of those things. And people's answers were fascinating. And it's not a question that we usually wrestle with because we're so much right now about can we just get through the next year safely?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I love that question for us as Jews. If we had to start to envision what we want things to look like, we have to understand where we came from and where we are now.
And it's not just look like for us. That's really the thing. We put it all together. Like you asked a great question at the end about Jews, the being relevant to them. Since we are hot-wired to care and want to make a difference, it's in our DNA. We need to pull back from our own survival mode and Judaism as a religion and recognize that Judaism is a mission not just for one people. It's a mission for humanity. It's a unique responsibility. It's chosen for unique responsibility. And even, Jews who are completely disconnected, like a Bernie Sanders personality, in their heart of hearts, they still trying to fix the world. They do mean well, okay? I do believe on a deep level, he thinks he's doing good stuff. He's going to change the world. When Jews for Judaism make incredible role models for the world. And as I've said a million times, you can't represent the Jewish people till you know what the Jewish people represent. When you take that Jewish hardware, that drive, that caring, that radically transformative thinking, and you give it that software, that system given from the big guy upstairs, which was adapted by so many great modern thinkers in the last hundreds of years to create liberal democracy. You put that Torah software into that Jewish body, then you get like Jews for Judaism make incredible role models for the world. Why do we have this? Is I don't know. We're not going to go into this topic now as we round up, but we should all be thinking, when we're in these turning points in civilization, humanity needs role models. We got the system that has been so positively transformative, even indirectly.
Right.
Why don't we? Why aren't we coming together as a people, educated and focusing that energy and that drive on not just on ourselves, not on just our survival and our security, but on finishing that job that Abraham started and connecting humanity to the vision, the values, the rules that came from God that have been so powerfully transformative that the world so badly needs. And that's huge because you can be a doctor, a lawyer, you can be a politician. These are not two things, these are not mutually exclusive. You can be a
Yeah.
well-connected, educated Jew who uses whatever you're doing in this world, and it's not unique to Judaism. The non-Jewish world, we got the seven Noahide laws. This is a system that's for everyone. We have to all get on that same page. And the real solution to all of this is rather than trying to figure out which system works the best of all the flawed human systems that we have, and why not just go back and see what the infinite creator of the universe thinks of the that seems to be you can run that through a laboratory, and that seems to be what has worked and will continue to work best. And it's really the only hope for humanity to live together in peace and prosperity. And that's really what the messianic vision is all about. It's not just a Jewish thing, it's all of humanity living together with peace and prosperity and connection and responsibility. And we should just see that soon and in our days.
Amen. 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 It also makes me think that how powerful it would be is if the Jewish people could come together and work as a team, meaning having different jobs and different opinions and different perspectives, but working together instead of continuing to fall prey to all of the forces outside of us that are trying to divide and conquer us, right? Make us hate each other, make us judge each other, make us fight each other, make us like all of those things. If we think that that's not happening, we're not watching what's going on in the world. But if we were to actually able to all be on the same team and be united, it would be quite something to see what
Yeah.
we were capable of doing in the world today. I think it's a fascinating thought experiment.
Amen.
Yeah,
Really,
awesome. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you
really.
for listening or watching if you're watching us on YouTube. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Leave us a comment. Support us on Ko-Fi. All of the links are in our podcast bio and on YouTube. Thank you everyone for joining us. And I think that's all for today. Rabbi Ken Spiro.
Bye bye.
Welcome.